All right, I'm going to talk today about the crushing of democracy that was Reconstruction. But first, before we get into Reconstruction, we need to talk about the democratic nature of secession. After Abraham Lincoln was elected in November 1860, the people of Virginia voted in January 1861 to have a convention to discuss whether Virginia should remain in the Union. After a series of debates, um, the secessionists in the convention put the question of whether Virginia should leave or not. The results are depicted on the map. A dark blue is a county. Some counties had more than one delegate representing them because of population. So the dark blue means multiple delegates voting for Union. Light blue means one delegate voting for Union. Dark red is multiple delegates voting to leave the Union, and pink is one delegate voting to leave the Union, and the gray are voters who were not there that day, or delegates who were not there that day. On April 15th, Abraham Lincoln called for troops to invade the southern states and overthrow their elected state governments, and the question of remaining in the Union or leaving the Union, it's like they flipped a switch. The delegates changed their votes on April 17th when the secessionists put the vote again, and the overwhelming majority of the convention voted to leave the Union, other than the counties that are on the Ohio River or the Maryland border. The With a couple of exceptions. The question was sent to the people of Virginia to have a direct referendum, and that referendum took place on May 3rd. The results by county are listed on the slide here on the map. The dark red are counties that voted 83.3% or greater in favor of leaving the Union. The ones that are a lighter shade of red or a dark shade of pink are ones that voted between 66% and 83% to leave the Union. The pink are where a majority of the voters voted to leave the Union. The light blue are ones where a majority voted to stay in the Union. The darker blue or medium blue there is ones between 66 and 83% voted to stay in the Union, and the dark blue are the ones where 83 or better percent of the voters voted to stay in the Union. Again, you'll see that the Union sentiment is all the counties that border the Ohio or the Kanawha River or the state of Maryland. I'm sorry, the state of Pennsylvania. Overall, the vote and the official tally of the vote was 126,000 to 21,000 in favor of leaving the Union. Or the Library of Virginia has since filled in some of the gaps because some counties weren't reported, and they assert that the vote was 129,000 to 32,000. Still, an overwhelming majority of Virginians no longer wanted to stay in the Union. So secession was an overwhelmingly Democratic policy. The Unionist delegates formed their own convention met in Wheeling in the northern panhandle, and they professed to be the representatives of the entire state of Virginia, and yet the delegates only from the blue counties depicted on the map are the ones that showed there, and yet despite this, it's the northern third of the state of West Virginia, plus Alexandria and Arlington. But they claim to be the entire state of Virginia. And Abraham Lincoln accepted them as the legitimate government of Virginia. Well, that legitimate or the loyal government of Virginia voted to carve the western counties off of the state of Virginia, and what was left was the boundaries, basically the boundaries that we know now. This, quote, restored government of Virginia met in Alexandria, and they had representatives from the counties depicted. This tiny proportion proclaimed themselves to be the legitimate representatives of the loyal state of Virginia. So that's what the government consisted of in 1863. The loyal government elected Francis Pierpont as the governor, and they undertook a number of things, including accepting the secession of West Virginia from the Commonwealth, even though they were nowhere near representative of the state of Virginia. The quote-unquote loyal government of Virginia voted to have a convention to draft a new constitution. And so they met in 1864. They were represented, here the counties depicted were represented. And basically what it amounts to was wherever the U.S. Army could monitor the polling places, those counties were represented. The rest of the Commonwealth was not represented at all. And yet they drafted a new constitution for the Old Dominion. Two of the key players in Virginia history at the time that are sort of not talked about as much as they probably should be were, on the left is John B. Baldwin, and to the right is Alexander Hugh Holmes Stewart, both from Stanton. They played a pretty important role in events that transpired in secession and in Reconstruction. Both of them opposed secession on April 4th. Both of them eventually changed their votes to pro-secession on April 17th. They were not enthusiastic about leaving the Union. They tried to keep the Union together. But when Lincoln called for the use of military force to overthrow the elected state governments of the South, they both came around and said, I'm going to vote to leave the Union. Baldwin went on to serve as a colonel of the 52nd Virginia Infantry for a while before health made him resign, and Stewart went home and did not take an active role in politics. Here's a graph depicting black and white voting over the course of the decade. You'll see that there was a great number of votes by white Virginians in 1860 and 61. In 1865, there was a massive drop in voting. And then in 1867, when the Republicans discovered that they needed black voters, the black voting jumped from 0 in 1865 up to 90,000 in 1867. Reconstruction, The Crushing of Democracy by Jonathan White. Reconstruction, like all history of the late unpleasantness, has a wide range of interpretations. Some argue that it was a carnival of corruption. Others argue that it was an unfinished revolution, that the Union forces could have forced white Southerners to grant even more concessions. There is evidence to support both these positions. I usually urge my students to start by defining their terms. So let me do that here. Reconstruction was the return of the seceded states to the Union between 1861 and 1877. It happened in different states at different times. I will argue here that Reconstruction was what federal abuse looks like when democratic processes cannot rein them in. When the war ended in 1865, what policy options were on the table? Virginia conservative Alexander H. Stewart from Stanton wrote, "At the close of the war, we were assured that upon the repeal of the Ordinance of Secession, the repudiation of the Confederate debt, and the emancipation of the slaves, we would be restored to our rights in the Union." Unquote. In exchange for this, Southerners believed that they would be returned to their former condition in the Union, and on that basis, they laid down their arms and stopped fighting. So what did Southern states do after the defeat? Well, first, they disavowed secession. Southern states repealed their ordinances of secession. South Carolina, for example, repealed its ordinance of secession in September 1865. Then, on September 21st, 1865, Alabama, as another example, declared her ordinance of secession, quote, null and void, unquote. Back in August of 1861, the Rump government of Virginia had declared secession null and void. Second, they acknowledged that slavery was done. South Carolina Governor Benjamin Franklin Perry, for example, wrote that African slavery is gone, dead forever, never to be revived, unquote. The Confederate states either A, outlawed the practice as a state law, or B, approved the 13th Amendment, or both. Every Confederate state, every ex-Confederate state, but Mississippi, Florida, and Texas approved the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. This is important because the Secretary of State of the United States counted the former Confederate states in the numerator and the denominator to achieve 3/4 of the states. An amendment has got to have 2/3 of both houses of Congress and then 3/4 of the states. The Secretary of State is the guy that keeps track of that. And the Secretary of State counted the ex-Confederate states in both the numerator and the denominator to achieve 3/4 of the states. So the ex-Confederate states were back in the Union as of 1865. This will become important later. Virginia, for example, ratified the 13th Amendment on February 9th, 1865. The final issue was the repudiation of the war debt. Anyone who had purchased Confederate war bonds had lost their money. In the film Gone with the Wind, Mr. O'Hara, Scarlett O'Hara's father, goes insane and is seen saying, "It's okay, we still have money, we have these Confederate war bonds." Well, obviously, after the war, these were worthless. The Southern states accepted and complied with the agreement that was on the table in 1865. Now let us consider what the South got instead of being returned to their place in the Union. In exchange for compliance, Southerners received the crushing of democracy and the abuse of authority by the Union Army. First, let's look at the federal crushing of democracy, the overthrowing of elected state governments and replacing them with military governments. Union forces overthrew the Southern state governments. President Andrew Johnson, for example, overthrew the government of Virginia by force on May 9, 1865. In Alabama, Union forces arrested Alabama Governor Thomas Watts on May 1st, 1865. Next, the Union Party went about denying ex-Confederate states congressional representation in December of 1865. Okay, so in the autumn of 1865, Southerners, having complied with their end of the bargain, they went to the polls and elected members of Congress for the session that was going to start in December of 1865. Alabama, for example, elected 5 Whigs, so not Democrats, not Republicans, Whigs, who would oppose secession, and 1 Democrat, the Confederate General Cullen Battle. They elected native New Yorker Lewis Parsons, who was a Democrat from Talladega, and native Tennessean George S. Houston, a Democrat from Florence, to the U.S. Senate. All were denied seats in violation of the Constitution. Now, the Constitution says, quote, "No state shall, without its consent, be deprived of equal suffrage in the Senate," unquote. And yet these men were denied their seat in the Senate. In Virginia, the results were similar. Joseph E. Segar of King William County, who had served in the U.S. Congress during the Civil War, and John C. Underwood, a Northern man who had served on the federal bench during the Civil War, were elected to the Senate. Both were denied seats in the Senate in violation of the Constitution. Congressional candidates Alexander H. Stewart and Robert Y. Conrad, who had both opposed secession, won seats in the House, but they were also denied their seats. This story was repeated in ex-Confederate state after ex-Confederate state, even though nobody in Appomattox had said, "Oh, by the way, once the war's over, we're going to deny you representation in the Congress." This was part of the radical Republican political philosophy. Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania had said that the Southern states, open quote, "ought never to be recognized as capable of acting in the Union or of being counted as valid states until the Constitution shall have been so amended as to make it what its framers intended, and so as to secure the perpetual ascendancy to the party of the Union," by which he meant the Republican Party, "and so as to render our Republican government firm and stable forever," unquote. Well, not everybody was buying the Republican propaganda. Senator James Dixon of Connecticut, so a Northern man, looked at this and he said, quote, "The purpose of the radicals was the saving of the Republican Party rather than the saving of the Union." So these radical Republicans were saying, it doesn't matter what's good for the country. It doesn't matter what's constitutional, what's legal, what's ethical. We have to do what's good for the Republican Party. Republicans, especially radical Republicans, were appalled when they realized that their military victory would mean. Having won the war to force these states to remain in the Union, now the ex-Confederate states would be sending Democratic, or at least non-Republican, delegations to Congress. And the GOP, instead of controlling federal policy, was going to find itself outnumbered in Congress. Even worse, once the census of 1870 was completed, the slaves, which used to count as 3/5 for purposes of representation in the House of Representatives, would now count as 5/5, even though they would not be voting. Because there's a difference between whether you count for the apportionment of seats in the House and whether you get to vote for those representatives. The Southern states, read the Democrats, would then have an even greater advantage once seats in Congress were reapportioned after the 1870 census. Something had to be done to prevent the Republicans from being outvoted in Congress. So, in December of 1865, when Congress met again after the end of the war, Republicans refused to seat Southern delegations. Now, this was the party of government of the people, by the people, for the people. And yet, when the people vote and send their representatives to Congress, Republicans said, no, we are not going to seat these people that have been elected. Interesting policy. Next, the Republicans passed the Reconstruction Acts. These were vetoed by President Johnson as too radical. In his veto message, he wrote, quote, "Those who advocated the right of secession alleged in their own justification that we had no regard for law and that their rights of property, life, and liberty would not be safe under the Constitution as administered by us. If we now verify their assertion, we prove that they were in truth and in fact fighting for their liberty, and instead of branding their leaders as dishonoring with the dishonoring name of traitors against a righteous and legal government, we elevate them in history to the rank of self-sacrificing patriots, consecrate them to the admiration of the world, and place them by the side of Washington and Hampton and Sidney." Unquote. Republicans passed the Reconstruction Act over Johnson's veto. Then, to remove any doubt as to the constitutionality of the act, they passed the 14th Amendment and sent it to the states for ratification. They disfranchised the southern states as states, created military districts with appointed military governors. For example, Virginia became Military District 1 with Major General John Schofield as the commander. Republicans told the southern states, and this is me putting words in their mouth, but you'll bear with me, "You are no longer in the Union and will only be admitted when you adopt a constitution that we like and adopt the 14th Amendment." The Congress even investigated whether Maryland, which had never seceded, had a Republican form of government and if it could not be expelled from the Union. That's how radical the radical Republicans were. They took a state which had never seceded and said, maybe we can eject that government as well. The North fought a war to prevent the South from leaving the Union. The Southern states lost and found themselves in 1865 back in the Union. To prove this is so, the Southern states were counted with the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery. Then, after the ratification of the 13th Amendment, the North kicked the Southern states out of the Union and told them they could only rejoin the Union once they ratified the 14th Amendment. Southerners said, in effect, wait a minute, how can we be in the Union for the ratification of the 13th Amendment in the summer of 65 and then out of the Union until we ratify the 14th Amendment? And if we're out of the Union, how can we ratify any amendment at all? States that are not in the Union can't vote on amendments. Well, the Northern Republican answer to this was, in effect, shut up. We've got the guns. Government of the people, by the people, and for the people. By constitution we like, the Republicans meant one that only allowed likely Republican voters to vote. The reason was simple. If ex-Confederate soldiers got to vote, they were not likely to vote Republican. The Republicans were blamed for the misery, all the misery that the South was experiencing. The Confederacy had universal white male conscription, so almost every white man got drafted, and whether they wanted to fight or not. And if a man had answered the call of his state during the war, the federal government then said, you are not allowed to vote. Some other voters had to be found. So enter two famous characters from Reconstruction, the carpetbagger and the scalawag. A carpetbagger was a northerner who came south with his possessions in a carpet bag or a suitcase. Not having been in the South during the war, they were not ex-Confederates and thus could not be banned from voting. The scalawag was the quisling Southerner who had somehow dodged the draft or not served in the army or any civil office, and thus he could vote. They cooperated with the occupiers and the carpetbaggers. Thus, a significant portion of the accepted electorate were both A, foreigners, or B, draft dodgers. But there were not enough of these for Republican purposes. So one thing the South did have in abundance was African Americans. But they were not voters, at least not yet. The only states in the Union in 1860 that had allowed African Americans to vote were in New England and in New York. In Ohio in 1860, it was illegal for African Americans to enter the state. In Illinois, it was illegal to be black. The northern states had tiny black populations, but outside of New England, no state allowed them to vote. They had lots of potential black voters in the South. The South had lots of potential black voters, but for whom would the freedmen vote? Some might, and did, be tempted to vote for the Democrats like their former masters. There is a widespread misconception, I think, that all ex-slaves hated their ex-masters and would do whatever they didn't want them to do, but there were some cases in which ex-slaves and ex-masters had good relations, and I'm sure that they told their ex-slaves, hey, I'm going to vote for the Democrat, I think you should too. Well, these freedmen had to be guided toward voting for the Republicans. Now, this wasn't a hard sell because of the party of Lincoln, etc. It wasn't difficult to convince black men to vote for the Republicans, but some didn't. Carpetbaggers set up an organization called the Union League to instruct black voters on how to vote and to punish freemen who voted the wrong way. Now, I'm going to quote inextensively from a historian on the Reconstruction. In the opinion of the League, the white Democrats were bad enough, but black Democrats were not to be tolerated. The first rule was that all blacks must support the radical Republican program. It was possible in some cases for a Negro to refrain from an active part in political affairs. He might even fail to vote. But it was martyrdom for a black man to be a Democrat, that is, to follow his old master in politics. If moral suasion failed to cause the delinquent to see the light, other methods were used. Threats were common from the first and often sufficed, and fines were levied by the Union League on recalcitrant members. In case of the more stubborn, a sound beating was usually effective in bringing about a change of heart. The offending freedman was bucked and gagged, which is a mid-19th century punishment designed to be painful and humiliating. And the thrashing administered, the sufferer being afraid to complain of the way he was treated. There were many cases of aggravated assault and, in a few instances, of murder. By such methods, the organization succeeded in keeping under its control almost the entire Negro population. The discipline over the active members was stringent. They were sworn to obey the orders of the officials. A black man near Clayton, Alabama, disobeyed the captain of the League and was tied up by his thumbs. Another, for a similar offense, was bucked and whipped. Now, this is the Union League whipping black men for not voting the right way. Government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Not every Northerner agreed with automatically giving the freedmen the right to vote. General William T. Sherman, for example, wrote to his brother, "This whole idea of giving the votes to the Negroes was to create just that many votes to be used by others for political uses." Sherman disapproved of enfranchising African Americans so that, quote, politicians may manufacture just so much more pliable electioneering material. Meanwhile, once Virginia had disfranchised all of its ex-Confederates and enfranchised all the freedmen, in 1868 the Old Dominion elected a convention to draft a new constitution for the state. Registering to vote for this convention was stringent. An indication of how stringent can be seen in the case of James R. Bub Rudd. Before the war, Rudd had volunteered to join a unit called the Old Dominion Rifles of Alexandria. The unit was called up in 1861 and sent to Winchester. Rudd did not want to fight against the Union, so he deserted before First Manassas in July of 1861 and was eventually discharged. Rudd in 1868 went to live in Union-occupied Alexandria and stayed there throughout the war. He joined the Union League. When he went to register in 1868, a black member of the 7th Ward Republican Club challenged his right to register. A Union general named Bacon denied Rudd the right. Southerners also got treated to the military abuse of power. In Greensboro, Alabama in 1867, Tom Cowan had an altercation with a black Union soldier. A Yankee officer stepped up to Mr. Cowan and slapped him in the face. The young man drew his pistol and killed the officer. Black soldiers Black Union soldiers went wild, ransacking private residences and confiscating all the firearms in the hands of the white citizens in the town. In the confusion, Cowan escaped. Then, Union soldiers went to Cowan's home and dragged his younger brother for it, declaring their intention to keep him as a hostage and to hang him if his brother did not return. Now, the Union soldiers knew that the brother had not committed the murder, but they were going to hang him anyway. The Union soldiers told the people of the town that they would not hang the innocent young man if paid $9,000. The money was gathered and sent to a Union general named Marsh, who was also a Mason, and so was Cowan. Marsh was based in Marion, Alabama. Marsh ordered the young man not to be executed. In Demopolis, Alabama, an elderly man named Mr. Hatch was arrested, taken 50 miles away to Selma, placed in a dirty jail, and told he could leave if he posted a $500 bond. He was never tried, but he never got his money back. Southern newspapers resumed printing shortly after Appomattox, and they covered these abuses of power. Of course, Union authorities did not like Southern newspapers exposing their graft and corruption. In 1867, General John Schofield warned the Richmond Times to stop, quote, fostering enmity, unquote, or he would close the newspaper. And then in June, Schofield did exactly that. He ordered the newspaper closed because of what it printed, despite the prohibition in the Constitution on abridging freedom of the press. Southerners also started honoring Confederate veterans by hanging portraits of them in their houses, and Republicans were very upset by this. President Andrew Johnson, who was not a Republican, was quoted as saying, "The idea of muzzling the press and tying the tongues of the people of the South after the manner of the suspicious tyrants and the Holy Inquisition in the Old World," Johnson denounced this as absurd. A people should be allowed to grumble who have suffered so much, and they would be unworthy of the name man if they did not respect the brave officers who have suffered with them and honor the memory of the gallant dead who sleep on 100 battlefields around their homes. The southern states went about electing new constitutional conventions with the existing voter rules. And in Virginia in 1870, the new constitution was going to be voted on by two sides. Letting slaves vote, with two side questions, letting slaves vote and forbidding ex-Confederates to vote. Well, when the vote happened, ex-slave voting was approved and ex-Confederate voting was also approved. Thus, both blacks and Confederates could end up voting. And Virginia was readmitted to the Union on January 26, 1870. Okay, I set out to demonstrate that Reconstruction was a period of anti-democratic action and abuse. It was in the interest of the South to end this military occupation as soon as possible. Robert E. Lee argued against erecting Confederate war monuments on battlefields, which would, quote, keep open the sores of the war, close quote. In regard to Confederate monuments, Lee wrote, "As regards the erection of such a monument as is contemplated, my conviction is that however grateful it would be to the feelings of the South, the attempt in the present condition of the country would have the effect of retarding instead of accelerating its accomplishment, and of continuing, if not adding to, the difficulties under which the Southern people labor. All I think that can be done now is to aid our noble and generous women in their efforts to protect the graves and mark the last resting places of those who have fallen, and wait for better times." Again, note the context. Virginia was still occupied, and Virginians were not permitted to vote. Lee, at the time, thought ending those occupation conditions was more important than erecting monuments, especially if the erection of monuments to war dead would prolong the occupation. So what's the relevance of Reconstruction today? We're now, one could say, in our third Reconstruction. Richmond is once again occupied by carpetbaggers and scalawags. The recent amendments to laws in regards to Confederate memorials demonstrates that. The same spirit, furthermore, the same spirit of radicalism that we saw in 1861 to 1870 is back. It again wants to abridge free speech. You had a candidate say that the First Amendment does not protect disinformation without specifying what he considers disinformation. The same spirit of radicalism wants to manufacture, quote, voting material, as Sherman had said, this time out of illegal immigrants. If we can just get them in the country and then amnesty them and then work in the process of getting them voting. Thus, we should remember the past. We should refrain from any act of violence. Leviathan loves it when opponents engage in violence because it excuses governmental abuse. And most importantly, we should vote. So I would urge you all to do that.